The chapel froze when my mother's voice cut through the air. You changed your name. Not shock, but pure, absolute judgment. Every head in the room, stiff and silent, turned toward the aisle where I stood. My father's hand, resting heavily on the funeral program, tightened, causing the cheap paper to crumple. My brother, Brendan, who had been loudly laughing with some cousins in the doorway, stopped dead. I didn't flinch. I simply slid into the second row seat, the space I had chosen deliberately, not in the front row marked family. The program, still warm from the printer in my palm, had my new name, Evelyn Morrison, printed in a black that looked almost deliberate, a final stamp of clarity. The chair right beside me, the one truly marked for family, remained untouched, an empty, accusing gap in the polished wood pews. It looked exactly like every single milestone they had missed my entire life. In that quiet, sacred space, I finally understood the truth. They thought the silence around my name exposed me, exposed some sort of dramatic, childish flight of fancy. But as I looked at that empty chair and then up at their shocked, pale faces, something shifted in the atmosphere. They had no idea that my silence, my new name, and my physical presence there, finally acknowledging Aunt Ruth, was exposing them. It was a silent, devastating announcement of a consequence they believed themselves immune to. My name, Evelyn Brennan, had been a quiet space at the edge of their lives, easily overlooked, easily forgotten. But Evelyn Morrison, a legal fact, was a boundary they could no longer simply step over. My arrival, unannounced and bearing the seal of a new identity, wasn't an olive branch or a plea for attention. It was the formal closure of a relationship they had abandoned years ago. The story of my life had always been about learning to shrink myself, to become smaller than the louder, more important lives around me. In our loud, sprawling house in Austin, noise meant importance, and importance was a currency I was never given. The pattern of neglect started almost before I could remember. It was subtle, woven into the fabric of our home life, but undeniable. I remember the sharp, demanding click of my mother's heels across the tile whenever my brother, Brendan, needed anything, whether it was a ride to soccer practice or a complicated permission slip signed. His needs were always loud, sharp, and urgent, in a way that my own needs never were. He got the immediate action, the focused attention. And my sister Vivian, she always got the soft tone, the warm hands lingering on her shoulders, the kind of gentle, full-bodied attention that made the entire room physically bend toward her. I was simply the quiet one. I was the one who was expected to clean up her own messes, who learned early how to pack her own lunch with absolute precision, and who understood not to interrupt the swirling, self-important conversations that flowed over my head like water. My existence was meant to be frictionless, a convenient part of the background. The first time I saw the pattern clearly, not as a feeling, but as a hard fact, I was 12. Vivian had her school art show, a glittering row of painted canvases propped along the gym wall. My mother was hovering near her, a radiant, proud smile plastered on her face for the neighbors, constantly brushing non-existent lint off Vivian's perfect dress. I stood in the corner, holding a crisp certificate I'd received earlier that morning. It was an award for winning a highly competitive regional science competition. Nobody in my family had come to that ceremony. They hadn't even remembered the time, let alone the date. My mother passed me as if I were a piece of furniture, or perhaps an accessory. She said, "Hold your sister's jacket," handing me the soft, heavy fabric without a flicker of acknowledgement in my direction. I folded the science certificate into my pocket. The expensive, thick paper crinkled loud enough to echo in the quiet corner where I stood. But no one, absolutely no one, heard it. Years later, at my high school graduation, they showed up late. Their arrival disruptive and loud. The ceremony had already started. My entire row of classmates had to awkwardly shuffle their feet as my parents and siblings searched noisily for seats. When my name was called to walk, I stood and scanned the sea of faces, desperately searching for the four that mattered most. Only one seat in the designated family section was empty. Mine. My siblings had gone to a lake party. My parents, I was told, were caught in traffic. though I later discovered the traffic involved a leisurely 45-minute stop for artisanal coffee. I held the printed program so tightly in my hand that the corner tore off entirely. I swallowed the deep, bitter sting of that realization and sat down slowly, deliberately, as if careful, controlled movements could somehow hide the aching emptiness. College wasn't any different. The landscape changed, the stakes got higher, but the ritual of neglect remained exactly the same. At Rice University, I worked tirelessly, eventually earning a significant departmental award from my undergraduate research in environmental science. Weeks ahead, I sent 3 separate reminders to my family about the award ceremony: a formal email, a personalized text message, and a note in the family calendar. Vivian texted back a dismissive heart emoji. Brendan, true to form, left the text message unseen. My parents finally replied 3 days later with a casual, non-committal, "We'll try," a phrase I was already learning translated to, "we'll forget." They never showed. That night, I ate sad, lukewarm takeout alone on the cold dorm steps, the prestigious award resting beside me, still inside the sealed envelope. They hadn't even opened it. The older I got, the quieter I became in their presence. I learned that pushing back, showing any sign of hurt or disappointment, only led to my mother's familiar, cold refrain, "Don't be dramatic, Evelyn." My father would always nod in numb agreement, his eyes never once lifted from the glowing screen of his phone. My protests, once loud and full of indignation, became shorter each year until they disappeared entirely, replaced by a suffocating, self-imposed silence. The last major flashback that stayed with me, stuck like a deep, infected splinter in my memory, was the ceremony where I presented my early research findings on desalination to a panel of major academics and investors. 5 seats had been reserved for my family, clearly labeled, and all 5 were empty. I stood at the podium, holding the folded program in my hand, smoothing the same crease over and over, an obsessive, nervous gesture, trying desperately to pretend the massive hollow space beside me wasn't noticeable to the entire room. In the middle of my presentation, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was a photo of Brendan, beaming, grilling sausages at a backyard party. He wrote, "Wish you were here." The casual cruelty of that message, the sheer effortless dismissal of 8 years of my life's work, was the absolute breaking point. That was the day the lesson was finally etched into my soul. I learned my permanent, unchangeable place in the family, a quiet space at the edge of their lives, never truly seen, never truly valued, unless I stayed silent and conveniently out of the way. I realized I was not a daughter or a sister. I was a minor inconvenience whose achievements only served to clutter their schedule. The final shift, the one that would change the course of my life forever, didn't happen in a sudden, dramatic explosion. It built slowly, relentlessly, like immense pressure behind a heavy door that I had kept closed out of sheer familial duty for years. But the day it finally cracked open was deceptively quiet, ordinary, and heartbreakingly normal. 8 months before my final PhD dissertation defense at Stanford, I sent the formal announcement to my family. It was a clean, official notice from the university, the date and the exact time printed in sharp black ink. I mailed the physical document to the house in Austin, I texted a reminder, and I meticulously added it to the family chat. April 22nd, 3 p.m., I wrote in the chat. My mother responded hours later with a distant, distracted, "So proud, sweetheart." Vivian sent a single, meaningless thumbs-up emoji. Brendan typed simply, "Nice." I forced myself to believe it was enough. Through the entire winter, I repeated the date at every single Sunday dinner. I didn't want any excuses. My mother would nod vaguely without once lifting her eyes from her phone. My father would simply murmur something that might have been agreement or might have been a complaint about the meal. Vivian would immediately pivot the conversation to her kids' complex soccer schedules. Brendan would relentlessly circle back to his latest barbecue experiments. I kept reminding them anyway. 5 months, 3 months, 6 weeks, 2 weeks. Each reminder felt exactly like tapping softly on a locked window, soundless from the other side. Then in early February, Brendan posted a full graphic invitation to his annual spring barbecue bash. The poster boldly proclaimed,
April 22nd, 1 p.m. to 6 p.m. My dissertation was at 3. I stared at the screen for so long that the pixels blurred. When I finally called him, my voice was dangerously level. He sounded genuinely, infuriatingly confused. "What time is your thing again?" he asked, like he hadn't heard it 20 separate times. 3, I said, my throat tight. "Well, people can do both," he replied cheerfully. "Just come after." Stanford was a full hour away from Austin. He knew that. He simply did not care. I called Mom next. She laughed softly, dismissively. "Honey, don't be dramatic. We'll work something out." But in that moment, I felt the quiet, cold certainty sink into my bones. They weren't confused. They weren't suddenly busy. They simply chose something else. Someone else. Like always. The final absolute confirmation came late in the afternoon the day before my defense. I called my mother one last time. She answered over a wall.
The drive away from the chapel wasn't just physical distance, it was the final, definitive cutting of the emotional umbilical cord. Watching their faces blur in the side mirror, shocked, confused, and suddenly powerless, I felt the immense weight I had carried for decades finally lift. For the first time, the loss of the relationship was definitively theirs, not mine. They were mourning the convenient, quiet ghost of Evelyn Brennan. I was driving toward the concrete reality of Evelyn Morrison. The journey back to Portland felt restorative, each mile cementing my new reality. I consciously put Austin behind me, focusing on the gray, misty promise of Oregon. The city settled around me like a comforting blanket, quiet, unhurried, and blessedly indifferent to my past. My new life flowed without effort. The rhythms were simple, centered entirely on my work and my well-being. I walked to the environmental consulting firm, drank coffee in my small kitchen, and let the gentle sound of water filling the silence replace the need to desperately break it. My work, focused on complex water reclamation models, became my sanctuary. On my desk, the neat lines of my research were illuminated by the diffuse morning light, making everything look calmer than my inner world sometimes felt. The steadiness I had found upon arriving in Portland deepened into a permanent foundation. My professional life flourished. The name Evelyn Morrison appeared on memos, email signatures, and detailed project briefs. Each sighting was a quiet affirmation of belonging. I noticed a subtle but powerful change in my interactions with colleagues. They asked for my opinion because they valued the scientist in the room, not because they were trying to compare me to some invisible, louder relative. My coworker, Alex, became a steady fixture. He wasn't overtly dramatic or overly familiar. He simply listened. He remembered the nuances of my desalination work, he showed genuine, focused interest, and he never once made me feel like I was taking up too much space or time. He valued Evelyn Morrison, the accomplished, complex person, not the accessory sibling. This unconditional validation was a quiet balm to the wounds inflicted by my family's constant dismissiveness. I also began the quiet, crucial work of reframing the memory of the empty chair. I would sit on my narrow balcony, the city humming softly beneath the persistent Oregon rain, and visualize the defense. Initially, the memory was a raw, gaping wound, but over time, as I processed the closure the paperwork had provided, its shape began to change. It wasn't an ache anymore. It transformed into a small, flat photograph tucked away in the back of my mind. The emptiness no longer represented their failure to love me, but rather the space I had cleared to build my own life. I realized with a surprising clarity that I didn't hate them. Hatred requires immense weight, a constant tether to the past, and I no longer had the capacity or the desire to carry their emotional baggage. The legal boundary wasn't a punishment for them. It was a necessary proof of where I had finally learned to stand, on my own ground, secure and seen. The silence that now filled my apartment wasn't the echo of neglect. It was my own peace, earned and undeniable.